Okay, guys, I'm going to be graphing a lot with you just so we could get, sorry, this stand is shaking. Just bear with it. We're not having an earthquake. It's just, I hit the stand. Okay, I'm going to be graphing a lot with you just so we could get what's going on. And we're bringing in a lot of things. We're bringing all of our graphs in to understand what is going on. So we're in the expansion phase of the business cycles. The problem is inflation is over 3%. Okay, and so what I want us to look at, sorry guys, is how does that look on our graph? So here's price level, here's real GDP, and I'm going to do everything at equilibrium. So here's aggregate supply, here's aggregate demand. I have inflation over 3%. So my curve will shift to the right? Because that's showing me that prices are going higher and there's too much demand, too many dollars chasing too few goods. So the government realizes, wow, inflation is a problem. There is too many dollars out there, right? People are causing prices go up. So the government is going to do contractionary fiscal policy where they're going to tax more and government spend less. And so once they implement these tools, we're going to graph what the impact is. So I'm going to start my graph at inflation with high inflation, right? So here's my aggregate supply. My aggregate demand curve will intersect on this vertical axis because that tells me high prices, right? But output isn't increasing. If the government taxes more, what's going to happen to that aggregate demand curve? It's going to shift to the left, right? People don't have as much money. Okay, so this is the after effects of them being used. Okay, so what we're going to look at is because of the contractionary fiscal policy used, what happened to aggregate demand? It went down. What happened to GDP? GDP also went down. What happened to the price level? The price level went down. What happened to inflation? Inflation went down. What happened to unemployment? It went up. Okay, do y'all see this? Aggregate demand goes down, GDP goes down, right? People are not demanding much, so we're not going to produce as much. Price level will decrease because people have stopped demanding. Inflation goes down, unemployment goes up. The impact of this is now the government is taxing, the government is going to run a budget surplus. Okay, so now I'm going to graph these with all of my curves. So I want to graph it with aggregate demand, the short run aggregate supply, and the long run aggregate supply. So this is price level. This is real GDP. Okay, I'm going to graph everything at equilibrium first. And to do that, I just put everything in a star to graph everything at equilibrium. This is aggregate demand. This is the short run aggregate supply. This is the long run aggregate supply. I want to show that inflation is my problem. So I know my aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. And this causes right here, do y'all see this triangle? This space, this is a gap. This gap right here is in an expansionary, I don't even have my thing open. This is an expansionary or inflationary gap. Okay, so if the government decreases government spending and increases taxes, I want to graph out what will happen in the long run. So this is price level, this axis. This is real GDP, this axis. I need to do everything at an expansion, right? That there's too much aggregate demand. So I'm going to draw everything. Okay, it's not at equilibrium, right? have to have that gap. Here's that gap. That's an expansionary gap. Long run aggregate supply. This is my short run aggregate supply. This is my aggregate demand. This is too much inflation, right? Prices going high. This is my inflationary gap. Well, if the government's going to tax people, all of a sudden this aggregate demand curve is going to shift back down, hopefully to get us back to equilibrium. Okay? Okay, so now I need to graph the Phillips curve. My Phillips curve axis is I for inflation and then U for unemployment. I need to graph everything. This is the Phillips curve. Okay? I need to show that inflation is occurring. So I'm going to put my point up here because there's high inflation, low unemployment, right? This is an expansion. Well, if the government taxes more and the government spends less, I need to draw what happens on the Phillips curve. So here's I, because that's this axis. Here is U over here. Originally, I'm up here, right? Inflation, point A. If the government taxes, people are going to have less money, right? So then less money means less spending. So inflation goes down and it moves us down to point B. See, inflation was high up here. Now inflation is low, but now unemployment was very low over here. Now unemployment is high. Okay. All right, I'm going to go to the back side. All right, what we're going to be looking at is loanable funds. Okay, how much is out there? Okay, so in an expansion, what policy does the Fed run? The Fed runs, we know it's called tight or contractionary. Nary monetary policy. Okay, so to contract the money supply, they increase the reserve requirement, they increase the discount rate, and they sell bonds, securities in the open market. So I need to graph what happened, and this is on monetary policy from a long time ago. This is the interest rate. This is the demand of money. This is my demand for money. This is my supply of money. If all of this increases, the reserve requirement, the discount rate, the government sells and takes money out, my supply curve of money is going to move to the left. What has happened with the interest rate? The interest rate was here, and now what has happened to the interest rate? The interest rate went up, right? So what they did was decrease the money supply, right? So we're going to have to graph what happens to demand for money. Hey, what is the impact? Well, if the interest rate goes up, here we go. I'm going to do this. I have a high interest rate, right? A very low money supply. Interest rate is high, right? So what's going to happen to the demand for money? Do people want to borrow money at that much? No. So the demand for money goes down. And eventually, this will cause the interest rate to decline. Eventually, in the future. Okay? Okay, so now looking at what has happened. Because of the Fed's policy, what happened to loanable funds? Loanable funds went down. What happened to the interest rate? The interest rate went up. What happened to the money market? The money market went down. Okay? So the government, now when the government is not borrowing, because they're decreasing their spending, right? Okay? When the government decreases their spending, that means like there's a cup. Like just think about the money supply being a cup. Here's my cup. And when the government is putting their hand in, it crowds everybody out. But now the government's not spending, so they take their hand out of the money supply and that allows people to go in. That's called crowding in. So when the government borrowing is called, at this one, crowding in, it makes available, making funds available for I, which we know is business, and C, which is known as consumers. But at this time, do they really want to borrow? No. So we're going to graph the impact on the PPC. Oh, do y'all remember that curve from a long time ago? This is where we compare two goods because we have an opportunity cost, capital goods, and consumer goods. Okay, this curve looks like that. Well, now that there's more available funds for businesses to get, our curve will shift outwards, right? And so the impact on the long run, let me do this, price level, real GDP, everything at equilibrium. If there's more funds available for businesses to get a hold of, businesses will increase supply, so that short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, and now that shows me that expansion, okay, because businesses get their money on stuff. Okay, this next part right here that talks about foreign exchange, guess what? We don't have to do it for the AP test.